Good morning for those on the West Coast. Good afternoon for those on the East Coast like me. And thank you for joining us at the 19th Annual Acquisition Research Symposium. This panel is panel number 6, titled Supply Chain Concerns. My name is Matt Beebe. I'm the Director of Acquisition at Defense Logistics Agency, and we do about $40 billion worth of procurement of supplies and commodities annually. So as you can imagine, this topic is of great interest to us. I am chairing the panel, and I am joined by panelists Emily de la Bruyere of Horizon Advisory, Jake Smithwick of the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, and Carol Woody with the Carnegie Mellon University. We often make reference to the roles that government, academia, and industry all play in improving our collective efforts to support and defend national security. And that is very much on display here today. As I scan the list of all the panels and papers, they touch on every current issue facing us: innovation, technology, organizational management, contract management, workforce skills, development, data analytics, policy implications, and that's just to touch on a few. This event illustrates the expansive breadth of the field, and I hope you all have the opportunity to hear from not only the 3 panelists that I will introduce here in a moment, but from some of the many others as well. I will start our conversation today by sharing a little bit of my perspective on the panel topic, again titled Supply Chain Concerns. If I had said 5, maybe even only 3 years ago, what that meant to all of you, supply chain concerns, we might have all come up with a different sort of definition or reference as we thought about the topic. But given that supply chain disruptions has been at the forefront of our daily conversations, whether it be on nightly newscasts or conversations with our families and neighbors, I think we've all solidified a bit more what we think about when we think about supply chain concerns. What has become obvious to us all is that we live in a world that is dependent on an increasingly interconnected global chain, where one plant closure or a port delay or a cyber incident can have ripple effects throughout multiple industries. I often say that DLA has been dealing with supply chain concerns since we were created 60 years ago. Our mission is essentially supply chain management and logistics assurance to our customers. So risk, as in the risk of not being able to deliver to our customer, is something we've always been addressing. And as such, we have built mitigations in many ways: redundant contract coverage, safety stocks, even working with industry to pre-position materials or preserve products in case of an emergency. But what has changed over the last several decades is the interconnectedness and commercialization of those supply chains. Not enough to just know who our prime supplier is, or to assume you can replace one vendor with another, or build enough military stock for dual use. The interconnectedness and commercialization of the global supply chains is forcing us all, military and commercial companies, to become supply chain risk managers, to have a greater understanding of the various tiers of suppliers and who they supply and who supplies them. As an example, last week I attended an American Apparel and Footwear Association conference, and one of the speakers was Walmart's lead of supply chain resilience. He shared how it is no longer enough to manage performance through brute force. Again, Walmart, a major player, they were able to manage through brute force, focusing only on cost and delivery. But now they have had to become risk managers as they have seen disruptions affect them in a very significant way. And here are some recent examples from the DLA lens of where we have seen that sort of interconnectedness. DLA provides fire hoses to the National Forest Service to fight wildfires. There are many ongoing today. There's neoprene used in those fire hoses. And during the during the pandemic, that neoprene was also needed for vaccine syringes and became in very short supply, and we were having difficulty supplying the National Forest Service. Another example, we needed liquid oxygen for national security satellite launches. And a lot of that liquid oxygen had been diverted to the hospitals, obviously in support of COVID patients. We were able to get sufficient for the satellite launches, but believe me, it was touch and go. Today, in Eastern Europe, we are providing food supplies to the US forces in Europe. There has been an avian flu in the United States. There have been port delays in Europe, and the European Union has instituted a new certification requirement, which is causing us difficulties in getting the product to the troops. I'll assure you, none of the troops are hungry, but they don't all have their favorite choices that they are accustomed to. So as we all move forward to this new normal, there is no argument over the need for greater supply chain risk management. The question for me, and what I expect our presenters will touch on, is the how. Given the complexity of supply chains, this is not an easy task. Frameworks and approaches are needed to help us all. And with that, we're going to kick off our presentations. As a reminder, and as we move through the presentations, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to pose questions for the panelists, and we will answer as many of those questions as we can. So first off, we do have Emily, who will present the supply chain resilience in an era of long-term peacetime competition. Emily, over to you.
Thank you for the introduction, and I hope that this presentation can contribute in some small way to the question of frameworks for supply chain assessment and understanding. I'm going to take 1 second to share my screen, and then we'll begin. And while that prepares to load, thank you for having me today. My name is Emily de la Bruyere. I'm a co-founder of Horizon Advisory. We're a geopolitical consulting firm focused on understanding China's approach to industrial policy, as well as to the risks and opportunities that can pose for American competitiveness. Our paper today focuses on, first of all, me being able to share my screen. And second of all, the new threats created by today's geopolitical and environmental trends. And the imperative for developing an updated supply chain assessment program in response. The basic argument we begin with is that, needless to say, the defense industrial base is grappling with two parallel and mutually enforcing trends. And if we go on to past this introductory slide and the roadmap, then we can move. Perfect. The first of those trends is a growing role of dual-use relevant technologies. The second, a growing reliance as part and parcel of that on complex global supply chains. Both of these trends create efficiencies in terms of cost and in terms of access to innovation. But they both also create major vulnerabilities that can threaten the effectiveness of the US security apparatus. They expose the US defense industrial base to dependence on, but also access from, an insecure international ecosystem. With that comes the risk of adversarial influence, as well as of disruption from general market uncertainty. On the first front, this can be manifest in reliance on technologies that grant, for example, China access to information or that depend on Chinese production. On the second front, think, for example, of, as was already mentioned, pandemic-induced supply chain dysfunctions. All of these risks are particularly acute and particularly threatening, considering that China, which the Department of Defense has identified as a great power adversary, actively positions to manipulate supply chain risks. Beijing's industrial policy targets effective monopoly of key nodes and strategic value chains. whether that means dominating production of rare earths, for example, or that of commercial UAVs. Further, Beijing sees such dominance and therefore asymmetric supply chain control as a means of coercive leverage to be used for competitive ends. This has been evident from China's actions for over a decade. In 2010, China cut off rare earth exports to Japan, for example, in the midst of a territorial dispute. This is also an approach that Beijing is explicit about in its industrial policy and strategic discussions. And these are realities for which the US acquisition process must update. The Pentagon Military Services and Defense Acquisition Program officials must rethink their frameworks for assessing supply chain integrity. Also, the risks that dependencies all along acquisition program value chains can create, and of course, responsive acquisition processes. If we move to the next slide, a framework for doing this would first expand the scope of risk factors that are considered. So that would mean looking not only, for example, at provision of goods and technology and the risks they can create, but also at provision of capital. For example, a Chinese pool of capital's investments in a semiconductor manufacturer should be considered a risk factor in supply chain vetting, alongside, for example, reliance on the reliance of that manufacturer on electronic grade silicon sourced from China. Similarly, in terms of expanding the scope of risk factors considered, we should consider sales dependence on China as a risk factor for a supplier, alongside, say, its dependence on China for actual goods. The next B is to expand the scope of the risk surface considered. Acquisition vetting should look holistically all along the supply chain, from the upstream down to the downstream. Beijing's approach to weaponizing supply chains prioritizes the upstream. It treats them as integrated wholes and concentrates on foundations first. Relatedly, US acquisition processes should also screen for risks multiple steps up the supply chain, not just among first and second tier suppliers. If we move on to the next slide, we see the semiconductor industry as a ripe case study for both the imperative of developing such a risk vetting approach and the feasibility of doing so. Semiconductors are a prerequisite for everything from, and we can stay on the next slide, thank you, for everything from unmanned aerial vehicles to fighter planes to electronic warfare components. And in many cases, these sophisticated military systems rely on the same semiconductors that fuel civilian consumer goods. Accordingly, semiconductors used for defense purposes rely on the same global, convoluted, as evident in the picture on the left of this slide, value chain as do those for civilian purposes. At a surface level, the United States is a leader in the international semiconductor industry. It boasts major high-profile downstream brand names like Intel, like Micron, like Qualcomm. However, this leadership in the downstream and in the high tech belies a set of really remarkable dependencies, including dependencies on China. First, US semiconductor national champions depend on production in China as well as sales into the Chinese market. And this gives Beijing the ability to disrupt their operations as well as to influence their boardrooms. China dominates international production of electronic components and the products built on top of them. As a result, most US and international semiconductor vendors rely on manufacturing facilities in China. They also sell their products back into the Chinese market, which means a sort of double-ended dependence. Intel offers a ripe example. Intel's website lists 17 campuses in China. It has at least 2 production sites in China, and it operates a series of innovation and R&D centers in the country. Intel also relies on a major set of Chinese suppliers and relies on China for approximately 26% of its revenue. These dependencies have already led Intel to face supply chain disruption, but also to make corporate decisions, including with regards to its statements on human rights that are influenced by the Chinese Communist Party. If we go on to the next slide, there's another element of this dependence in the semiconductor value chain on China, which is a disproportionate and growing reliance on Chinese inputs at the farther upstream of the value chain, whether that's packaging and testing or for electronic grade silicon. What this means is that effectively the industry, even if the high value offshoots are dominated by the US, is built on a foundation controlled by Beijing. These are not the flashy parts of the semiconductor value chain. They're considered dumb, they're labor and energy, but not capital and technology intensive. However, their relative sophistication has little bearing on the relative influence that can be derived from them. This is the foundation on which the international semiconductor industry is built. And this is where China has been making inroads, as you can see from the two figures on the left. This Chinese leverage over the international semiconductor value chain creates very real risks for the defense industrial base. These are also risks that Beijing is positioned to manipulate. If we move on to the next slide, China deploys a strategy of military-civil fusion, which combines the military and the commercial tools and ends into, for lack of a better word, holistic vision of international competition. And moreover, China sees today's international competition as one over supply chains. Over the past decades, Beijing has deliberately invested to capture key nodes in strategic international supply chains, including that for semiconductors, in order to secure coercive leverage in what it perceives to be today's competition. At the same time, China has sought to build relatively autonomous domestic industrial capabilities in order to ensure that its coercive leverage can be asymmetric, that it be able to threaten adversaries' industrial bases without facing equivalent consequences. Again, this is borne out in China's decision to cut off rare earths to Japan in 2010 in a particularly acute way, but it's also something that plays out all across Chinese industrial policy and resource allocations. And it creates a reality for which US acquisition processes have not updated, because existing protocols for assessing supply chain integrity fail appropriately to address upstream vulnerabilities or sales-side dependencies, which are the areas where China's manufacturing prowess and enormous market risk granting have the greatest influence. And as the US defense acquisition apparatus increasingly turns to off-the-shelf commercial products and dual-use technologies, these risks become all the greater because we're becoming more reliant on unscreened value chains, amplifying our exposure in the defense industrial base to China's military-civil fusion strategy. For that reason, if we move on to the next slide, touching at least in a framing way on potential solutions, we suggest a risk-informed acquisition process. What does this look like? A first part of it is defense. It means extending the kind of intelligence inputs that guide the system threat assessment phases of the JCIDS process to include supply chain risks. It also means extending capstone threat assessments and related foreign country and system-specific inputs to address adversarial influence over key material inputs and supply lines. And the other part here is that we have these tools for foreign ownership control or influence review and related industrial-based monitoring, and those should be broadened in their applications to address a wider set of influence vectors. Those are all defensive measures. There's another element here that is also critical, and that's playing offense. That's actually finding alternatives and investing in them. What offense means is it means investing all across the value chains of critical defense industries. Think, for example, of the Trusted Foundry program, but then broadening it to reach the upstream of electronic grade silicon, not just the downstream of where foundries are. This isn't something, though, that can just be undertaken at this offensive level by the public sector. It requires public-private partnerships that can incentivize private sector investments to encourage defense-relevant productive capabilities. And there's a stick along with that carrot, which is that we need enhanced regulation on the private sector to disincentivize dependence on or technology sharing with China. Right now, so many of the American industrial champions in the defense industrial base are increasingly dependent on Beijing and are sharing technology, and that needs to be something that is regulated to protect against. And on that note, thank you for having me and also for sharing my presentation.
Thank you, Emily. And next up, we do have Jake, who is going to talk about organizational change considerations for implementation of performance-based logistics contracts. Jake?
Okay, thank you so much. And again, thank you, Matt, for the introduction. And thank you all for being here today. Fortunately, we all can be here in person together, but it's still nonetheless great to be with you all here today. So I appreciate your time. What we're going to talk about today is a couple of things. We'll go through our research question for this particular project, our methodology, and then some of what we learned in terms of going through this project here. Again, I encourage you, if you do have questions or comments, definitely use the chat box here. We're more than happy to, all of us as panelists are happy to do that. So be sure to use that as we go through the presentations. So a little bit about a background of this particular project. We're looking at performance-based logistics. What this focuses on, as many of you might be aware, is it focuses on the outcome of what we want to achieve as a buyer organization. And really what we're looking at here is how do we specify, or rather not specify the details of what we want, but rather the outcomes of what we're trying to achieve with this. Traditionally, as we know, a lot of procurement is more on the transactional side of things, of specifying the details of everything we need done, how that's going to work, and that is tremendously time consuming and difficult. And frankly, at the end of the day here, who's ever seen a perfect RFP or specification, right? Where there's always issues and different things that we see with that, right? So it becomes extremely cumbersome from a buyer standpoint for this, right? So some of the advantages as we go through this, why owners are particularly interested in this is because it's more efficient and it does leverage or use the expertise of the suppliers that we're looking to hire with this. Those are some of the major advantages why we look at PBL contracts and why we have an interest in that. From the supplier's perspective, one of the main benefits is there's a consistent or an expected level of funding on a regular basis for this particular project. And because of that, that means they can manage cash flow, long-term strategic capital investments are better, easier to do because of that. And also there's tends to be increased visibility when they do have on contract for a PBL type of setup. Major challenges with this, and this is what I'll focus on kind of the last quarter of my presentation here today, but the first thing is that owners, us as buyers, are used to doing the way we've always done things, right? And because of that, we tend to apply a very detailed, specific transactional approach to a PBL contract, and fundamentally, those are very different, right? In PBL, what we're really trying to ask for is, what do we want at the end of the day to meet our warfighters' needs? And we can't always specify the details of what that entails. And so it becomes really a paradigm shift when we go from one to the other. That's a major challenge to shift from how we've always kind of done things in this approach. The other challenge we've seen this as well, and sometimes certainly in the military environment, we can't always avoid that, is that the use of sole sourcing can certainly stifle competition. Now, certainly there's needs to do that, because if there's only one company that produces a certain part or component, and that's the only one available, then obviously, sole source is something we had to look at. But if you think through the broader considerations for how do we be what I like to call a client of choice or an owner of choice, is that we like to be fair, open, and transparent. And the reason why we do that is that when our industry partners, our suppliers, our vendors, see us as an owner that actually wants to partner with them and is willing to be fair, this will attract higher performing companies to work on our projects. And if we constantly sole source everything, that can be a major inhibitor to actually accomplishing that. The last part of this too, a major challenge with PBL contracts, is that to have that consistency in funding and a guarantee of a contract for a number of years, forecasting is extremely difficult. We don't know what our needs will be. Of course, COVID is a great example of that. But besides just that, forecasting for a number of years out what our needs will be can be certainly challenging. And so because of that, if we're looking at a performance-based outcome and going to set up a PBL contract, it can be difficult to do that. Now, one other part of the background here, I totally, I skipped over a little bit of my introduction. I am a professor at the University of North Carolina in Charlotte. I'm a board member of the Center for Procurement Excellence. We focus on procurement best practices. I also spent a number of years in the U.S. Air Force Reserve. So if you have anybody in the Air Force today, it's good to be amongst peers. I was at the 944 Fighter Wing on Luke Air Force Base, Glendale, Arizona, and I worked on emergency management. So it's certainly nice to be back in with everybody here today. So I've neglected to mention some of my background here today. So thinking about what our goal of the project is and what we're trying to achieve with this, there's a couple of major things. The major thing we understand with this particular project is what are the major barriers to successfully adopting PBL as a viable contracting option. In other words, we know that some government military agencies have used this, but why don't more units, departments, whoever use this broadly? And the way we're going to do that is that we interviewed multiple agencies, getting access to some of the information was extremely difficult. And because of that, we looked to other non-DoD resources to also get their perspective. So our primary mission on this particular project was to talk with folks that use PBLs to get their perspectives, and then also look at the data side of things to see, can we actually evaluate performance or lessons learned as part of this. So major results with this. When we asked folks about their positive experiences with PBL, there was a lot of really good things to say about it. People that have used it extensively, they got a variety of positive things that they had to say about that. Some examples here that were just listed based on our interviews with the groups we talked with: material availability, it went up dramatically. Response times were dramatically delayed. Obviously, in a warfighter situation, we need to provide supplies and materials to a potentially foreign location in a very rapid amount of time, and they found that using PBL structure correctly made that easier. Repair turnarounds, decreased savings. There's a lot of benefits to that as well. One of the things we learned with this as well is that performance evaluations can be extremely effective in ensuring long-term sustainment of the PBL contract. And said perhaps a different way is that if we tell people how things are going, and we all understand, that means we're more likely to quantify or really measure what's actually going on with the project. Now, as we talk with military agencies, we ask them, this is fantastic, can we see the data behind this? And look at schedule information, cost information, and to be frank with you all, it's very difficult to get access to some of that data. So in response to that, what we decided to do is we looked at other non-DoD resources to see, well, what have other industries done when they use PBL contracts? And we found that there's a number of state transportation agencies like DOTs that use these contracts. And so we collected a bunch of data. Most of this is from the Florida DOT and some other agencies. And we looked at the performance on their PBL contracts to evaluate what actually happened. The way we did this is we connected a variety of statistical tests. The primary we used was a pretty straightforward analysis of variance, or ANOVA, to look at differences in performance grades or feedback and the overall scope complexity. The reason why we did this here is that the hypothesis, if you will, is that, well, if you have a more difficult project or more complexity on that contract, we're more likely to have issues. And so we wanted to factor that in as we evaluated performance on these PBL type contracts. We categorized these different contracts that we had available. There was several hundred that we looked at, and we also used some other statistical measures to measure the strength of those differences between the contracts. Okay, so what do we find? What we found here is that there are statistical differences between suppliers, even after accounting for different scope types. Now, friends here today, this is a major takeaway. And the reason why it's so important here is that this tells us, as we all know, it's not shocking, but we know that there is a difference in capability and performance of the suppliers that we use. And if we all know that, then we can quantify that. That means we should evaluate that or consider that in terms of how we successfully manage for the taxpayer, how we're going to deliver these different types of contracts. We found too here is that regular constructive feedback between the owner and the supplier, and vice versa from the supplier to the owner, was stated to be of paramount importance. When we talked to the military groups that we work with the DOTs, that was a regular thing that came up, is that providing that feedback to the key parties involved with it was certainly of value and importance as well. So besides, or in spite of, I should say, these really positive benefits, why isn't PBL used more often? And that kind of will conclude my presentation here today, is organizational change, meaning we're used to doing one thing, and how do we change our organization to do something totally different? Our group, my research team, we've worked on this a number of times in a number of situations. What we did here is to understand how procurement organizations change effectively. As we collected through our own firsthand experience and a variety of other methods, as we collected hundreds of case studies of procurement organizational change and what the impact was. And what we found here is that there is a very consistent outcome depending on what the audience or those that are affected by the change looks like. What I mean by that, if you look at the entirety of an organization, what we found in our research is that if this group over here is about 30% or less, in other words, people that really don't want to do the change, has a direct impact on the success of that outcome. Now, there's a whole other presentation to talk about this in detail. If you certainly want details, reach out to me. I'd be glad to talk to you about that. But what this means here is that if we're going to do something different as an organization, there's a way that works well, and there's ways that don't work as well. The other thing with this too is that as we look at the organizations in terms of how we lay out or roll out org change in procurement is what works well and what doesn't. What we found here, again, this is not a small sample. This is hundreds of contracts for a variety of different things here, is that we found that workshops and on the job support is a great way to do that. So if you're switching over to PBL or you want to use it more often, these are really great ways to do that, right? What doesn't work well are speeches and emails. Right? So if you want to make sure that the change is not going to take place, then write a letter about it and have a meeting about it, right? What we found here is that having workshops, hands-on experiences is certainly a better outcome as we look at that. So again, there's a lot more details with that, but I just want to highlight the fact that when we think about organizational change and the outcomes with that, there's some key things that work well and things that don't. PBL certainly offer some advantages, some significant advantages, especially on a cost saving standpoint, and the ability to specify, here's what I need as a buyer, and you as a supplier, you tell us the best way to get there. Evaluating performance on a regular basis is certainly important. And like I said, organizational change can be a great way to help us do more of this here. But it's not just like we're going to walk and say, well, we're doing something different and that's what it is, right? There's a process. It's not a light switch. It takes a number of years and time to actually get this done. I also want to mention here today that if you do want to learn more about this, you can check out the Center for Procurement. There's resources, templates, and other educational offerings that might be of interest. And certainly feel free to email me if you do have any questions or comments. I would be glad to chat with you on that. And with that said, Matt, I'll turn the time back over to you.
Thank you, Jake. And just want to remind everybody to put your questions in the Q&A tab. There's only been one question, and that had to do with availability of presentations, which has been answered in the chat. But I want to make sure we do have some questions for the panel when we are done. With that, we are going to shift over to Carol, who's going to talk about integration of supply chain risk management across the DevSecOps lifecycle. Carol? And Carol, we are not yet hearing you.
Thank you. I got the presentation up and forgot about the mute button. My name is Carol Woody, and I'm a principal researcher at the Software Engineering Institute, which is a research center for the Department of Defense under the umbrella of Carnegie Mellon University. My research focuses on integrating cybersecurity into acquisition, engineering, and software development so that we can produce products that can be secured in the operational environment. It's my privilege to share research my team has underway to support effective implementation of supply chain risk management. We work with major programs that must address an extensive use of technology, hardware, software, firmware that includes third-party components, software libraries, tools, desktops, any other hardware that all of these run on, and services such as cloud and others that are all third-party providers. There's a great deal of guidance for what should be done for each one of these areas, but actually integrating it within the acquisition and development processes is not a trivial matter. Supply chain risk is nothing new. High impact attacks from third-party products in terms of dollars and data volume has been documented over many, many years. But these impacts were primarily handled with the operational environment. until around 2020, when solar winds compromised hundreds of the organizational operational security environments. And then Log4j carried that impact into the development environment, which was not even looking for attacks, much less prepared to address them. Supply chain risk now involves tasks that are scattered across the entire program landscape and beyond. An integrated approach is needed that includes governance, supplier selection, management, engineering development, and infrastructure. The reliance on third-party components and capabilities is so extensive that the supply chain impacts every aspect of mission success. Program and acquisition management has primarily focused on cost and schedule. And suppliers have been often considered trustworthy just because they were not under undue foreign influence. But we need to recognize that every supplier relationship must be appropriately bounded and managed. Security plan documents have to be turned into effective practices that are pervasive and continuous across all participants in program success. We see a lot of point solutions, such as periodic assessments, but these are insufficient for today's supply chain risk. Our research has identified 4 major areas of responsibility that need to participate in critical supply chain risk management activities. And these are shown in our diagram here. We have focused our initial attention on engineering and acquisition supply management because we're leveraging earlier work that where we develop methods for these 2 key areas. And we have specific in-depth experience in working with them. We have experience with a security and engineering risk analysis that's focused on the engineering side, and then external dependencies management effort that's focused on the supplier side. The framework that we have constructed is structured into the 4 practice areas that I showed you on the other slide. Each of these is further divided into domains, which are then represented in goals that need to be addressed. And then within those goals, we have specific practices. This is a structure similar to what was used with the capability maturity models that SEI has developed in the past. And there are many aspects of maturity within what we're seeing in this acquisition security area. And so we feel that as we're able to further codify the framework, we'll be able to integrate this with a maturity approach. One of the primary areas we focused on is the engineering lifecycle. And we have identified 3 key domains that need to be part of the supply chain risk management focus. There are activities that relate to supply chain risk management integrated into each of these areas through the 12 specific goal areas that we've identified. What I think you can see from this screen is that these activities touch on many different parts of an acquisition and development program. And so the parts and pieces are somewhat scattered without integration, even at the program level, because the program activities themselves relative to risk are primarily structured around cost and schedule. Within the supplier dependency, we have also identified 3 key areas that relate to 14 specific goal areas. Again, these are key elements in terms of initiating and then managing and then sustaining supplier relationships that all become part of what's needed to be considered with supplier risk. And too frequently, these activities are actually distributed outside of a major program effort, so that they will almost subdivide and contract out parts of the acquisition pieces to other parts of the organization or even externally. And the communication and relationships of how these need to be tied together is very uneven. What I've put together here in the interest of time is one specific example so that you can look at how this is structured. The paper itself has the greater detail of going into many of them, but for a presentation, I wanted to give you a sense of the elements that are here within the supplier dependency management. We have this relationship formation that's of major concern. And one of the goals there is actually establishing it as planned. So as you've defined it in what you want with your program protection plans, with your other strategy documents and structures, then how are those actually being addressed in terms of the processes themselves? These are potentially questions that not just the acquisition group can answer. These are questions that then are pervasive throughout other areas of the organization that need to all be part of addressing how this work is actually done and sustained over time. We're currently working with several programs to actually apply these specific practices that we've identified in these 2 areas, the engineering lifecycle and the supplier dependency management. What we found is that each of these programs has their own unique organizational and governance structures. They have their own unique supplier requirements and their own mechanisms for actually determining third-party components. Many of these decisions making efforts are widely distributed throughout subunits of the program itself. But somewhere each of these goals that I've pointed out in terms of what needs to be done in these domains have to be identified and minimized to address security risk and synchronized across all of these different groups. Otherwise, you have gaps. And establishing the responsibilities for these is critical to actually meeting the goals. It's got to be someone's responsibility to coordinate these pieces. And that seems to be a major missing factor in a lot of our approaches and mechanisms in the current acquisition development lifecycle. The challenges are only going to increase as the attacker capabilities grow and as our dependency on third-party components and services also grows. The existing risks with the currently fielded systems are high, and investments in further expanded areas of technology are only increasing in risk with artificial intelligence, machine learning, and other algorithms that further challenge our security concerns because we don't have good mechanisms for controlling these. So we need to understand what the risks are and then structure ways to handle them as we bring them into our operational environment. The framework has been developed to date based on SEI experiences, and we know these are incomplete in terms of total program needs. So what we are hoping to do is to motivate you to look through the paper and give us feedback if you see areas that you feel are missing, incomplete, or inaccurate. We have a submission here at the end of this slide for your information, and we would welcome your input. I've included in the slides some reference material to cybersecurity engineering if this is an area of interest, and would recommend it to you to increase your knowledge in this area, and also to welcome your feedback here as well. So with that, I will thank you for your attention and turn the program back over to Matthew.
Thank you, Carol. And we're going to be moving into our Q&A section. First of all, at the beginning, I mentioned good morning to some, those on the West Coast, good afternoon for those like me on the East Coast. I also noticed we have somebody that it's a good evening. I noticed that we do have Joseph from Bahrain, and there may have been others from overseas. So we are spanning the time zones. Not a lot of questions thus far, although I expect maybe a few will pick up. I'm going to start with Jake. Jake, you did already answer one in text in the Q&A function concerning the perception of upfront costs being possibly a barrier or a reason not to enter into a PBL. But let me expand on that question. So not only would I like you to share the answer to that for everybody, but also you state that a successful PBL requires a shared commitment from both buyer and supplier, or at least that was in your paper. I do know that with defense budgets, which are very often very uncertain, that there is often a hesitancy to commit to a minimum service level, you might say, when we often trade off those service levels due to budget realities. And so my question is related to one, would you answer the question that you answered in the text, but then also respond to my comment? Over.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks, Matt, for the question. Really the first part of this is that, we did hear that when we did our interviews, we talked with different folks about this, is that, the main benefit that they do like with PBLs is that certainty that if there's a specialized component or part for an aircraft, for example, and it needs to be repaired over a number of years, I mean, having a manufacturer have that capability to produce that part, which can be afforded under a PBL, was of tremendous interest to the owner, to the agency that we talked with here. Because if there's deployments overseas and whatnot, I mean, having those parts available was extremely important. Now, the second part of your comment, Matt, is what do we do when we have a budget this year and then next year it might be slashed, right? Or maybe the year after it go up, and that variability is a very real situation, and I fully acknowledge that. We've worked with a number of public agencies over the year, and that's certainly not something new that we've heard before. My recommendation, as I've worked with other agencies on this particular issue, is to explain the impact that it has on us as a buyer when there's not certainty in what we're doing. And what I mean by that is that we take the approach that us as a buyer organization, we want to be what's seen as a client of choice. I mean, right now, as we all know, that there's extreme labor workforce issues. Getting contractors to propose on our projects is extremely difficult because there's lots of other options out there. So in one regard, we're actually in competition with each other as a buyer of these services. And so for that reason, I recommend, whether it's a local city council or it's a Congress people that are involved in actually approving these budgets here, they explain that the very real impact that not having this guaranteed level of funding limits our ability to successfully meet the needs or the missions of what we're meant to do. And so there's no silver bullet. I wish there was, but the reality is that we had to explain to our constituents, or I should say to those that provide the funding for us, that if we can't guarantee that has major significant impacts on our ability to be seen as that client of choice from our industry partners. Does that help clarify the question, Matt?
Yeah, thank you. And we'll see if we get any follow-up questions. And also thank you very much, Jake, for making reference to the DLA Global Tire Program in your presentation. I did like that slide. I might print it. So
sure.
Let me move on. And we do have a question from Bill in the Q&A section for Emily. He speaks to, you spoke a lot to China and the influence of China, and now we also have the scenario playing out in Eastern Europe, where Russia has certainly experienced supply chain issues as they try to rely on their organic national capability. And Bill would like you to comment on what you see in that as a case study.
That's a great question. Thank you. And there are two answers, or two main answers to it I'd go to. One of them is kind of eliding the question itself, but one of the things that makes the competition with China distinct and that changes the equation for looking at their relative industrial autonomy is that this appears to be trending as a great power peacetime competition without the explicit conflict elements that define Russia's current approach. And what that means is that it stops being a question of absolute independence or lack thereof and becomes one of relative dependencies. So as long as China can avoid engaging in outright confrontation, which appears to be Beijing's proclivity, then it is able to claim leverage over and effectively win the supply chain contest without having total autonomy, and instead by having more relative influence over, for example, American supply chains than the US does over Chinese supply chains. All of which is a long way of saying that yes, China, like Russia, has really critical dependencies in its defense industrial base as well as broader industrial base. However, Beijing's efforts orient less around making sure that there are no dependencies and more around making sure that China has asymmetric influence over us, meaning the United States in this context. And also that China is better able to pull those levers, which in a relatively unstructured answer to this question then gets to a next point, which is that if we are engaged in a peacetime supply chain competition, as China thinks we are, the two things to look at are not only how much relative independence versus dependence China has, but also to what degree Beijing is able to use that to achieve its objectives. So China has effective relatively centralized control over its industrial base and also over its quote unquote private sector's investment and trade. And what that means is that China can choose to, for example, cut off exports of rare earths or stockpile a certain product or encourage as opposed to prohibiting trade in a certain area. The United States, because we are a less centralized system with a free market, has much less of that ability, and therefore there's less of an ability to marshal what industrial control or advantage we do have.
Okay, thank you, Emily. And we'll see if there's any follow-on questions to that. Let me go over to Carol. Reminder to everybody that Carol was talking about integration of supply chain risk management across the DevSecOps lifecycle. And Carol, I don't think you made reference to the Department of Defense's cybersecurity maturity model, CMMC. And I'm wondering, what is your view on CMMC interacting with the framework that you spoke to?
Well, we are certainly compatible with it. The CMMC is part of that guidance that we're talking about in terms of what needs to be done and how it needs to be done. But the area we're focusing in on is how a program would actually organize that and structure it to end up with an effective handling of the cyber risk that is part of bringing any third party into the technology operational environment. Too frequently, we're seeing that with DevSecOps, with cloud, all of these are treated as standalone pieces. They're not looked at as how they need to tie together with how a program uses them, how the software is fielded on them, and how the governance for patching and keeping those current in terms of current vulnerability knowledge is actually implemented as the program moves forward with either its long-term implementations and its iterative focuses in terms of continuous monitoring. So the CMMC really defines what needs to be done. And we are trying to look at, with programs, how they're going about doing it to make that an effective implementation. I hope that clarifies what your question is.
Thank you. And just so that everybody knows, that was one of my questions. Did not see that one in the Q&A. So I do have another one, and this one is for Emily, back to Emily. And Emily, your paper references that the government alone cannot resolve the industrial weakness, and that Washington should focus on incentivizing the private sector to invest in long-term strategic interests of the United States. And you did speak to public-private partnerships and regulation. I'm just wondering what other examples you might have of either incentives or disincentives, and also what do you think is the likelihood that Congress will act in that manner?
Thank you. Trying to put meat on the bones here. On the incentives front, I think that there's a lot that can be accomplished simply from messaging that current policy measures are not passing trends. So for example, because tariffs and the potential relaxation of tariffs have been in the news right now, in theory, having imposed tariffs on imports of Chinese goods creates a market incentive to invest in their production in the US or in other more trusted ecosystems. But if it's messaged to the private sector that those tariffs will be relaxed any second, then that incentive is far weaker. And we're unlikely to see any real concrete action taken to make the kind of long-term deliberate investments that are necessary. So first thing is just there's a messaging that we're serious about this, and therefore that any disincentives or incentives that are implemented are going to last. A next beat is moves like we've seen potentially with the CHIPS Act. So outright government investment in industries that are considered to be strategic, but which should be adjusted in a way that spans the industry chain more broadly, while taking into account the kind of cooperation with the private sector that's been implemented in those actions. On the disincentives front, just from a defense acquisition perspective, I think there's also a lot to be done with making it clear that the advantages or the appeal of a government or defense contract should not go to players who are compromising their technology or their products through engagement with the CCP. So for example, major defense contractors who are also, through their positioning in China, adhering to Chinese data regulations, that could be a target for disincentives for investment outside of the US and technology sharing with China. So for example, a contractor will be ineligible for a defense contract if they are complying with Chinese data regulations in that country. I think there's a host of others that can be implemented that create a sort of mutual exclusivity where that's necessary, and where engagement with the Chinese economy effectively negates the possibility of productive contributions to the US defense industrial base. How likely is any of this to be implemented by Congress? I would say I was a good deal more optimistic about this about a year ago, when it seemed like both the China and the industry questions were one of the few areas of real bipartisan consensus on Capitol Hill. It seems now that while narratively that consensus is still there, there's little action to back it up. We've seen that even those bills that were seen to be surefire ones are not being passed, or are being slow rolled, or have been had the teeth cut out of them. So I think that this is something where we can't expect that Congress is going to make the necessary moves, and there may have to be a lot of action taken from a less legislative and more kind of on the margins regulatory approach.
Thank you, Emily, and I'll apologize if I caused you to get quoted for that last part in any publication. So with that, this question is for all of you, really, although I will start with Jake. This has to do with the fact that you all talked about a leadership commitment for change management. Jake, you actually used or made reference to change management. But really what I want to ask each of you, and Jake, will start with you and then see if either of the others want to add in, is can you speak to the role that leadership must play, to be able to succeed in your specific topics? Jake?
Yeah, that's a great question, Matt. What I would suggest here is that when we're thinking about, from a change management perspective, is that, I've been in the Air Force, we all have some sort of involvement with the military, one form or the other. And what I have found is that the typical need of, command and control, this is what we have to do, everybody just do it. There's a place and a need for that, absolutely. But I find that if we're trying to move our people from one situation or one approach to something different, that's not nearly as successful. So what I have found in a variety of research and other consulting projects that I've worked on over the years is that having people, what we might call change champions, that are considered to be peers of the people affected by the change, is how we actually can get this to go forward here. If I'm somebody that's affected by some sort of change that we're making, I would rather go talk to a peer and ask them, hey, I know that you're using this new system, how do I do it? As opposed to asking a leader about how to do something, right? So I think the role of leadership is more about alignment, of finding the right people to put them in a position to make these successes happen, as opposed to this is what you have to do and go, right? So that's kind of the main thing I would suggest with this, finding champions, change agent champions that can help actually make these things stick, because people are much more likely, more comfortable to make those changes if they feel comfortable with that.
Thanks, Jake. And let me go over to Carol and then Emily to see if there's anything you want to add. Carol?
Well, I would add that the role of leadership and what we're looking at in terms of are the right people coordinating requires them to be have some cognitive understanding of the kinds of coordination that's needed, and to really be asking the right questions to make sure that the different groups are not making their decisions in a vacuum, and holding them accountable for the lower level integrations to provide the right input and the right decisions so that they can better assemble risk tolerances. It also involves them looking beyond just cost and schedule and recognizing the importance of cybersecurity. We're certainly getting guidance and recommendations in terms of how that should be done, but most of that comes down in the forms of very general policies, and how they actually implement it is dependent on leadership taking the responsibility of making it a priority. Driving that seems to have to come from the top, because they have to be able to give people the time to focus on the levels of collaboration that are needed to make it happen.
Thank you, Carol. Emily, did you want to add anything?
Perhaps in a roundabout way, I think that maybe this is like an optimistic lesson to take. Needless to say, over the past few years, there's been a huge transformation in within the defense acquisition process toward, or there's been the rise of this idea of leveraging commercial dual use relevant technologies for the sake of efficiency. And that's been in many ways like a breakthrough in thinking brought about by a leadership intent on finding new frameworks. And I think it suggests that there is a lot of room for new approaches. And then there's a question of, can that kind of an approach be paired with one that emphasizes rather or in addition to efficiency, effectiveness? And can these efforts be paired with these efforts to access the new and innovative in the private sector? Can those be paired with efforts to protect the defense industrial base?
Okay, thank you, Emily. And I have one more question for all of you, and then I think unless we end up with something else popping up, that will close us out. So one more question for all of you. I will start with Carol and then go over to Emily and Jake to see if you have anything you want to add. And this has to do with the role that our industry partners play in managing risk and performance. Can you all elaborate a little, with respect to your proposal or framework? What are the mutual goals, mutual interests between government and industry with respect to your topic that we really need to leverage to get some progress in these areas? Carol, can you help?
I think the visibility of cybersecurity issues and the challenges in addressing that is a shared concern across programs as well as all of the vendors that participate. One of the challenges I think we have is not really being clear in terms of what the security requirements are for each individual program. Too frequently, the request from the government side is just make it secure, and the vendors are struggling with how do we do that? What will satisfy you? What does success look like? And in some cases, that involves really articulating what are the risks that we can tolerate. Too frequently, we've been looking at this from a perfection standpoint of let's eliminate all the risks. We can't afford that. We can't do that. There's too much involved in the technology for that. So we have to be realistic in terms of what constitutes appropriate levels of risk that we can tolerate and we can operationally manage. And maybe we think of recognizing and recovering it as opposed to preventing. It requires a different mindset to the problem space. And I think that's something that we're pushing in the dialogue to have people understand.
Thank you, Carol. Emily, do you want to add anything?
I think it goes without saying for the defense ecosystem that dependence on an adversary is a negative. For industry partners, that might be less obvious. However, the idea of having production disrupted is certainly a negative, and that goes without saying, or everywhere. And this idea of connecting the one to the other, which is increasingly evident in the realities of supply chain chaos, but perhaps hasn't been, and also hasn't been necessarily market thinking or industry thinking hasn't necessarily updated for this as a long-term trend. So I think that there is a lot of white space for the acquisition community to make clear to industry partners that reliance on an adversary is going to undermine their role as a defense supplier. And also that it can undermine their production. And if that's done, and therefore if the incentives are shifted for the private sector, there might actually be a huge, the private sector is adept at betting when it actually sees the incentive to do so. So that can actually create it can be the push for the kind of action that's necessary moving forward on the part of industry partners.
Thank you, Emily. Jake, any further thoughts on that?
No, the only other thing I would say is that we are in competition with each other as owners or buyers of services. And so it's important to be seen as a client of choice from a buyer standpoint to make sure that people actually want to work for us. as an organization. But I'll go to stop my comments there, Matt. I see we have another question for Carol, and so I'll turn the time back over to you.
Yes, we only have a few minutes left, and Carol, we did get a question. Hopefully you've seen it in the Q&A section having to do with tracking software dependencies through partnerships with organizations like GitHub is a name I'm not familiar with.
I think there certainly are opportunities. GitHub and for a data repository, cloud services that are centralized, structured ways of standardizing these can come up with standardized responses in terms of the kinds of risk that they are providing and are preventing, and the kinds of risks an organization may have to learn to deal with. Those, I think, are all opportunities, but what we're pushing with the framework is getting organizations to think beyond independent point solutions, because using GitHub as a data repository is not the answer to the system you're fielding. You still got other parts and pieces that need to work together with this. And so it's getting all of those synchronized so that you can understand the cyber risk you're dealing with across a program and understand how to address it is really moving one step beyond individual products. So we want to leverage those products, but we've got to be collaborating across them to get a total solution for cybersecurity risk.
Okay, thank you, Carol. And that does bring us to the end of our event. I want to thank all of our panelists, Carol, Emily, and Jake. Thank you very much. And I want to remind everybody to check your symposium program. There's a lot more scheduled events to take advantage of. With that, I thank you all, and we are complete here.